Okay, welcome to Chapter 6, which is a little bit of a doozy. So hang on, we're going to be looking at a lot of vocabulary and a lot of different concepts to cover the topics of light and color. The two topics are absolutely intertwined because our experience of color is absolutely related to how we physiologically perceive light. And all of these things fit into the topics we've already talked about. For example, light and how forms react to light and shade have a lot to do with our perception of space. So we'll be looking at some issues we've already covered and expanding into some new ideas. We begin by considering the issue of light. And I put up this image. This is the image that's presented in your book. It's a painting by Leonardo da Vinci called The Madonna of the Rocks. It's an early work by the artist. This is a little bit of a challenge, so before I even begin to address the issue that your book wants to address here, which is that of atmospheric perspective, something we've already talked about when we covered Masaccio and the tribute money, I want to raise another very interesting issue about this work, which is that we're not always sure what paintings are. This is a painting that, from what we know, Leonardo was commissioned to make this picture right around 1483 when he leaves Florence, he goes up to the city of Milan, and he's asked by the Confraternity of the Immaculate Conception to create the center panel for a triptych, for a three-part altarpiece. However, there are two versions of this picture that currently exist. This work is in the National Gallery of London, and there's another version of the work that exists in the Louvre. And I'm showing you the Louvre version of the picture here side by side. So you have to take this all with a grain of salt. There's lots of different explanations for the two works, but scholars are not in agreement if the picture on the left is actually by Leonardo, or whether it's a later copy that was made by followers, or whether Leonardo began it and some assistants completed it. I would argue 100% that the work from the Louvre, which is the work on the right, is the more authentic, what we would call an autograph work by the artist. You can actually see in the work some very, very striking differences, even though the compositions are the same. Both pictures have the same four characters in it, which is the Virgin Mary, the baby Jesus, St. John the Baptist, who's shown as also as a baby, who is Christ's cousin, and then an angel, called the angel Uriel. And this is supposed to be a scene where on the flight into Egypt, when the Holy Family is fleeing to save the Christ child, they run across the young St. John the Baptist in the wilderness with an angel. So these are the two versions of the scene. But there's a lot of reason to suggest that the one on the right is more authentic. First of all, I mean, some of it's over my head. Like, for example, I've read discussions by people who were geologists and botanists who talked about the fact that the rock formations on the right version, which is the Louvre version, and the plant formations are scientific. And we know that Leonardo spent a lot of his time in direct observation of nature, trying to record natural phenomenon. That I'm less in a position to say, but I can argue for several things here. First of all, one point I made when we looked at Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper is that Leonardo, in general, doesn't use halos in his images. In other words, the idea of a halo showing a visible ring of light around the head of a holy figure is standard iconography in terms of Christian religion, but for someone like Leonardo, who, by the way, was not very religious, he was far more of a scientist, Leonardo tried to usually in his works find ways to use natural light to suggest the divine. Think, for example, how in the Last Supper he puts Christ's head in the central window, sort of give him a natural halo. And if you notice, the London National Gallery version on the left, the figures, with the exception of the angel, have thin halos around their heads, whereas those are absent on the right. You also will notice a very different use of implied line, which is something that Leonardo makes fantastic use of in this work, and it's a topic we've already covered. So if you look at the picture on the right, the Louvre version, so this one is in Paris, as I kneel in front of the picture, I would catch the gaze of the angel Uriel, which is the kneeling figure with the red and green garment. I would then follow that gaze, and then her hand, or his hand, excuse me, which points towards the kneeling St. John the Baptist, who has his arms sort of in a prayer position facing back towards the Christ child, while Mary's arm wraps around St. John the Baptist's shoulder. So now you can either follow the line back up to Mary or follow the line down to the Christ child. And then ultimately we end up with this vertical axis where Mary's foreshortened hand is directly placed over the pointing hand of Uriel, which is directly placed over the blessing Christ down below. So there is this really dynamic way of moving you around the picture plane. If you look at the London National Gallery version, the omission of the pointing gesture of the angel and the aversion of his gaze really changes the way that the picture functions. There's also on the left a much more standard iconography. On the right-hand version from Paris, you as the viewer have to look at the relationships to understand the meaning. In other words, we understand the relationship that which child is Christ and which is St. John the Baptist by their gesture. Christ with the blessing gesture, St. John the Baptist kneeling with his hands sort of clasped in prayer. Whereas on the left-hand version from London, the artist here has added the very strong iconography of putting the wooden cross over St. John the Baptist's shoulder, which is a standard symbol for him, which is a little bit more pedestrian. In other words, Leonardo really relies on the nuance of the gesture, whereas that version with the halos and the standard iconography, it takes away some of the challenges that the artist poses. So, all of that said, I can't really look at the picture from London. So instead, let's look at the Louvre version. Okay, so here's your information about the work. And there is the subject, which is aerial and atmospheric perspective. And again, this is something that we've already addressed, but needs to be addressed not in terms of just the space chapter, but also in terms of the light chapter. Because ultimately, it is the effect of light and atmosphere and haze that creates the idea of aerial perspective, and the effect that when we look into the far distance, forms get further and further away from us. And if I put up this blown up detail, you can see the example that your book poses. That if you look, and you see the figures are all positioned sort of in this rocky outcropping, right? They're in some sort of a cave. If you look into the distance beyond Mary's head, we see a series of these mountainous forms. Projecting out of the ground, moving into the distance. And because of the use of light and dark, we read things as either close or far. So if you look at the series of mountains as they recede, the mountains that are closest to us are darker in color. They also have the most detail. And the ones that are further away tend to lose their chromatic identity. The forms are getting paler and less saturated, which are all things that we'll talk about. And are of a higher value as they move into the distance. So again, the use of light is something that is very much related to the notion of space. But we can look at other ways in which Leonardo uses light in this work. Now, one of the, I suppose, most basic ways that an artist who's interested in painting realistically uses light is through means of what we would call chiaroscuro. Right? Chiaroscuro is it's an Italian term. It develops, it's a concept we really see developing in the Renaissance, where the artists use light and shade to suggest the volume of an object, to show a curved surface. Chiaro literally means light, oscuro means dark, so chiaroscuro means from light to dark. And when an artist applies the concept of chiaroscuro, we call it modeling. Right? That's sort of like, you know, an artist will use model or will model a surface. And you can see that when we look at this detail from the Louvre version of the Madonna of the Rocks. We see the Christ child on the ground, blessing, and we see the kneeling angel Uriel. Now you can see several places where the artist is using chiaroscuro, or modeling here. Look, for example, at the drapery on the angel. Right, you can see the green drapery thrown over the shoulder. And what you'll see is that the artist has a regular hue that's being used, which is green. And the hue is simply, in simplest terms, it's the basic color. So you can see the green drape thrown over the shoulder, but that the artist is modeling that green, adding black to create shadows, adding white to create highlights. And so that convinces us that that drapery exists in real three-dimensional space. So again, it's related back to the concept of space. If I put, you know, a tennis ball on a table, it's very easy to see where the highlights hit in relationship to the light and where the shadow occurs. When an artist paints that effect onto a surface, he's convincing you that those objects exist in a real atmosphere, in a real space, with a real light source. So the artist is using two different ideas here. I put up the grayscale and then a series of blues in a range of values. The grayscale simply shows you the transition from light to dark in subtle gradations, and this is what's required of modeling. The blue scale shows you the way that this works when an artist is using color, and in most cases the artist is. And again, color and light are intimately entwined. So you have your basic hue, which in this example is blue, and then if the artist adds black to it, it becomes a shade. If the artist adds white to that hue, it becomes a tint of that color. So when the artist is modeling, he's using shades and tints of a specific hue to convince you of the three-dimensionality of the form. You can see this also very clearly if you look at the flesh of the Christ child, where you can see the way that there are shadows around the back and underneath the leg, and then these lightened highlights on the chest and top of the thigh, and you could see the transition between those two forms. So this is one way that light and shade convinces us of the reality of what we're looking at. Right, and here's another drawing where the artist is simply using value, right, which is light to shade, light to dark, as opposed to using color. Right, this is just a drawing in black and white crayon by the French artist Paul Collin. It's a drawing that was made probably of a dancer. Paul Collin was a poster designer for a troupe of about 20 musicians and dancers from Harlem who went to Paris in the 1920s. They were led by Josephine Baker. They were performing at the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées. So he becomes a poster designer, and this is probably some sort of a preparatory drawing or a drawing perhaps of one of the dancers. The reason I'm showing you this drawing, your book uses this as an example of basic chiaroscuro and modeling. So for example, if you look, and I highlighted an area here to look at on her forehead, you can see the way that the artist transitions from his use of white crayon to intensify the highlight. Then you could see the beige paper coming through as part of the modeling, and then the use of the black crayon to create these transitions from light to dark. But there are other ways that an artist can suggest the three-dimensionality of a form using light besides modeling. In this drawing, you also see evidence of a technique known as hatching. Hatching is when the artist uses a series of parallel lines, which can be more or less closely spaced, depending on the kind of shadow you want to suggest. If you very densely space these parallel lines, they suggest very deep shadow. More widely spaced, or the absence of hatch marks would suggest highlights. But you can also see, when you look at this work, evidence of hatching. Right? If you look on the woman's cheeks or even on her forehead, you'll see the use of these parallel lines as a way of suggesting shadow without using the subtle transition of modeling. Another example of this, even more prominent, because it's in pen and ink, is in Michelangelo's Head of a Satyr. This is a drawing that Michelangelo makes. By the way, note the wrong date. That is probably going to be appearing in your textbook. It certainly does in my proof edition. It's 1520-ish, not 1620. Michelangelo is long dead by then. But Michelangelo here is using really only hatching, as opposed to using both modeling and hatching. So an artist can use a single technique to express light and shade, or can use a variety of techniques all at once. So here you could see Michelangelo using hatching, and I've indicated where you see these mostly densely packed parallel lines to suggest shadow. And then to suggest even deeper shadow, Michelangelo uses the technique of cross-hatching. And that's when you use a second set of hatch marks placed at an angle to the first set of hatch marks. Right, so it creates a darker area. So you can see that particularly in the hollows of the cheekbones where the artist really wants to suggest very, very deep shadow. And you'll see the use of then thinner and more widely spaced hatch marks where there's not shadow, and then the absence of hatch marks. For example, on the cheekbones or on the ridge of the nose or on the earlobes where the artist wants to suggest the presence of light. The use of hatch marks for Michelangelo is interesting because he's primarily not a painter. I mean, some of you know Michelangelo most famously as the painter of the Sistine ceiling, but in reality he's a sculptor, and his mentality comes from sculpture. And so hatch marks also have a lot to do with his own process, working in the medium of marble as opposed to being an artist who thinks primarily in the medium of paint. If I show you a detail of Michelangelo's sculpture, and this is a very, very, very early sculpture he does when he's probably about 15 years old, called the Battle Relief. It's a series of battling figures, maybe a mythological battle of Lapiths and centaurs. You can see, even in stone, his presence of hatch marks. Look, for example, on the calf of the standing figure. Right, both of his calves, or on the shoulder. And you'll see these series of parallel lines that the artist is using. For Michelangelo, that's, as I said, a function of sculpture. Those parallel lines are actually created by the sculptor from his tools. The artist would use hammers and chisels. And the chisels were often these toothed chisels. Right, they're chisels with teeth on the end of it. And the artist would start with a very widely spaced tooth chisel and then work their way down to finer and finer ones until they get some smoothness to the surface before they have to begin the actual laborious task of polishing the stone, which Michelangelo hated and often didn't do. And so we're left with these hatch marks on the surface, which again, for Michelangelo, is a physical way of modeling sculpture. But you see him then using the hatch marks in both ways, as a pictorial device and as a sculptural tool. And there I've indicated those hatch marks a little more clearly for you. Now, chiaroscuro really is about this relatively subtle transition from light to shade. But artists over time begin to discover that while the subtle transition of light to shade, things like modeling, can suggest a form's three-dimensionality, but that light and shade also has dramatic potential. And so the idea is that the more dramatic the contrast between the light and shade, and in a lot of cases the more abrupt the transition from the light and shade, the more dramatic impact it will have on the viewer. And so you get a technique that is invented, it appears really at the beginning of the 17th century, called tenebrism, which is another Italian term coming from the Italian word tenebroso, which means murky. And in tenebrism, the artist often uses a very strong light source, sometimes hidden from the viewer, sometimes visible. Here it's visible, well, partly visible. There's a candle on the table, which is clearly casting some light into the scene, but the light in the scene is strong enough that there's perhaps another light source that is not visible to us, just outside of our picture plane. And the artist uses this abrupt light source to create very, very strong highlights and very, very deep black shadows. And black to the point where we usually lose the form and the image entirely. And so in this scene, there's much of the scene that we can't actually see. And in tenebrism, the transition, rather than being a very subtle transition from light to shade, very often the artist will place the areas of the brightest light directly adjacent to the area of the deepest shadow, which again is a very dramatic impact. Look, for example, at the arm of the standing woman, and you'll see where that line of light exists on her palm and then on the underside of her arm, but how quickly it transitions into complete blackness on the top of her arm. So again, the idea is that this kind of lighting would create a heightened sense of drama in the viewer. And that's something that Artemisia is interested in. I should talk about this scene a little bit. And the painter. This is a very, very famous painter and probably the first truly major female artist in Western painting. Her name is Artemisia Gentileschi. And she's referred to as one of these, she's called a Caravaggiste. Caravaggio was a very, very important and influential Italian painter who died in 1610. We consider him to be of the Baroque period, which is what Artemisia is as well. And Caravaggio dies very young, but has a tremendous impact on a series of other artists, including Artemisia, so she's considered one of his followers. But she herself was a very rare example of a female artist. She was trained by her father, whose name was Orazio Gentileschi. Orazio, too, was experimenting in the new dramatic potential for art, the drama of both the subject matter and the light effects that we see emerging in the Baroque. Now, Artemisia's story people are always incredibly interested in, because in addition to her being a very rare female artist, and that's mostly because if you wanted to be a female artist, there weren't a lot of opportunities for you, because traditionally the way that artists were trained, when they were maybe young teen, maybe 12, 13 years old, they would have entered into the workshop of a master. Let's say consider a painting workshop. And the artist would usually spend, the apprentice would spend maybe 6 years there. Their family would at first pay the master to train them, but over time some of the more skilled apprentices might actually start receiving a small salary. And they stayed and they were trained in all the basics of painting. They also functioned as, errand boys and truly workshop assistants. This wasn't considered appropriate for young girls, who also weren't really permitted to study from the nude and do other things that you would expect an artist of the, 16th and 17th century to do. So the only female artists we tend to get are ones that were trained by their fathers, if that was allowed to happen. And so that's how Artemisia becomes a painter. But her story is one that always gets a lot of interest, because when she was still working for her father, he also had other artists working for him, and one was a man named Agostino Tazzi, and he raped Artemisia. And it became the subject of a lawsuit and a trial. She testified. We have the records of all of this. And ultimately, if I'm not mistaken, Tazzi actually received some jail time, which is pretty remarkable. But in any case, Artemisia then spends the rest of her quite successful painting career painting scenes of virtuous women killing themselves and very strong, heroic women killing evil men. I mean, it's quite spectacular and relatively autobiographic in a lot of ways. In fact, the protagonists in her scene are often self-portraits, and there's certainly an element of that in this work as well. Now, this is a subject that Artemisia paints maybe 5 times during the course of her life, which is the story of Judith and Holofernes, which is from an apocryphal book of the Old Testament. And the story is that there's an Assyrian general named Holofernes who lays siege to the town where Judith lives, and that she decides she's determined to save her people, which she does because she's beautiful, and she sort of woos the guards, manages to gain access to Holofernes, gets him drunk, and then cuts off his head. And so we see Judith with her servant, with her maidservant, a woman named Abra. And you could see this is after the event. Judith is still brandishing the sword. Abra is trying to sneak the head into a bag. You could see them peeking outside of the tent that they're in. And so you can see the way that the drama of the subject matter plays into the artist's use of light. You almost sense she puts up her hand. It's almost like she's hushing the audience. She's also blocking the light. You could see the artist using another device of light in this work, which is cast shadow. So in addition to using light and shade to create volume of an object, the artist also convinces you of that object's relationship to space by means of cast shadow. So, for example, we understand the spatial relationship between the candle, her hand, and her face because of the way the light from the candle is interfered by her hand, which creates a cast shadow across her face. But again, there's a much greater sense of drama than is created simply by chiaroscuro. So it's like, tenebrism is chiaroscuro on steroids. Now, other artists will play with this idea of the contrast of light and dark creating really dramatic impacts and dramatic effects. Here I'm showing you the work of a photographer. Photography, is all about light. And that's how the image is actually created. And in this case, this is a Japanese artist called Hiroshi Sugimoto, who, a very interesting artist, born in 1948. He moves to New York City from Tokyo in the 1970s and begins to take photographic series. He does a series from the Museum of Natural History, he does a series on lightning, and then starting in the 1970s, he begins to photograph movie theaters. And so he continues that well into the 90s. So I'm showing you one image from your book, which is Studio Drive-In Culver City, and then some other images so that you can see the sort of serial effect of it. And it's an interesting set of photographs because he's playing with the idea of light and also space and time in a single image. What Sugimoto does, his technique, is that he would use a large format camera, set it up on a tripod. He would open the shutter as the movie was beginning, and he wouldn't close the shutter until the movie ended. And so he would expose the film the entire time. And the impact of this is pretty dramatic. And again, that's the effect that he's going for. Because what we're left with is the dark theater. You could still see the space of the theater. In a lot of cases, it's kind of interesting. He chooses sometimes these very intricate architectural spaces of the theaters, which is exactly what you're not supposed to look at in a movie, right? The architecture. But we can see the space of the theater, but where the movie was playing, we see just pure light, right? It becomes the image of time passing, really. And what was there, which in a movie would have been, you know, drama and storylines and love stories or murders and violence, all of it is reduced to this single image of just whiteness. And it's almost a reversal of what you expect, because he's taking the idea of cinema, which exists across over time, and he's turning it into a single still image. So the picture itself becomes about all of this time compressed into a single moment. And it's made dramatic by the impact and the contrast between light and shade. In fact, you know, your book makes the point that even in the Bible, there's this reference to light and shade having symbolic meaning, not just drama by visually seeing the contrast, but that light and shade actually have symbolic content. And that's something that, as I said, maybe exists in the Bible when God creates light and said that the light was good, but really gets sort of solidified in Western thought by the late 18th and early 19th century. You know, the idea of light as goodness and black as evil, which again, it's cultural. It's not anything real and tangible, but artists exploit this notion in their images. One striking example of this is this painting by Thomas Cole. And Thomas Cole is a member of what we call the Hudson River School. So it's a group of painters who are painting in New England, very often these big landscape images. And so this is Cole's, usually we call it the Oxbow, but your book has given you the much longer title. Oh, it's actually not in your textbook. Sorry. The view from Mount Holyoke, Northampton, Massachusetts after a thunderstorm, the Oxbow. The name of the Oxbow has to do with the Connecticut River, which is the river you see emerging into the scene, and this very sharp turn in the river, which was known as the Oxbow. And Cole here is using the contrast between light and dark for, one could argue, very clearly symbolic purposes. Now, what we're looking at ostensibly is what he says. It's a thunderstorm coming and passing. And Cole had actually described seeing a thunderstorm up close when he was out in the wilderness, and this seems maybe to almost be this autobiographical depiction of it. We see the storm that's passing still very active on the left-hand side of the picture. You could see lightning striking in the background. The broken tree in the foreground may be a result of the lightning. In fact, you could almost hear the lightning, because you can imagine as the lightning comes, then you'd hear the thunder. There's actually a trail of birds flying out of a tree about 1/3 of the way over from the left edge of the picture. So you almost sense that this is right in the middle of this blackening storm, but then as you look towards the right side of the picture, you see sunlight emerging, the sky clearing, light beginning to come through the clouds, the light drenching the landscape down below, the calm and stillness of the landscape. And the artist is playing with this notion, but it's more than just about light and dark and a storm passing. And he's using it for symbolic meaning. Look at the rest of the picture, because the two halves aren't just differentiated by light and shade. On the left-hand side of the picture, it's wilderness untamed. We have this very up-close view of the landscape. But the trees are wild and overgrown and broken, and it's precarious, unpassable land. It looks dangerous. And then on the right-hand side of the picture, we see cultivated landscape. So it's not overgrown wilderness. It's the wilderness subjugated by man. And so we see the fields are plowed, and you can see the crops growing and the crop patterns, and people on boats going down the river, and you know, smoke coming out of chimneys. And so this really is a picture where the light and the dark isn't just about the storm, but it's also about what people were perceiving as the destiny of the United States. You know, what was America's direction as a civilization? The idea of manifest destiny, that man would lay control to this overgrown wilderness and bend it to its will. And you can almost see that being reflected in the scene through the artist's use of light and dark. By the way, it is also a self-portrait. I don't know if you could actually see Thomas Cole here, but he's here. If you follow your eye down the central axis of the picture, you end up being pretty close if you land in the foreground. And here I've blown up a little section of it. You can see jutting across the river the artist's belongings, his umbrella, it might be his bag or his easel. And then you see a set-up easel. If you move your eye down that rocky formation to the left, you see the artist himself in a red coat and a yellow top hat, holding his brush, looking at the landscape in front of his canvas, and then turning to catch our gaze. So it's a very interesting image in that, in addition to showing lightness and darkness, he's also playing with the idea of scale to show man's smallness in comparison to nature. And we'll talk about scale in an upcoming chapter. Quite specifically and obviously, even though this cultural notion of white and black or lightness and darkness may go back as far as biblical times, in a modern context in America, it has a lot to do with the issue of race. And so this is an example of the artist playing with value scales, the idea of this subtle shift from lightness to darkness, this gradual shift, as being used to express contemporary political issues. And this is an artist, it's a Polish-American conceptual artist, right, named Nikolai Buglaj, called Racing Sideways. And it's a drawing, right? So it's just done with graphite and ink. So the artist, again, is not using color here. He's using that grayscale. But in the work, we see a series of runners. Right, there's 13 figures, all based on a mannequin, a single mannequin. And we see that as we move from left to right, we go from the whitest figure in the darkest clothes. And then the value scales work in the opposite manner. So as we go from left to right, the value of the skin tone becomes darker. So it progresses till we end up with the figure all the way on the right. And then the value scale of the clothing works in the opposite direction. So we have the black garment on the left working all the way to pure white on the right-hand side. And so you see all these runners, and they're running together. But the point of the work is that it's supposed to make us question our values and whether or not the runners are all tied, and whether or not that equality is real, and whether or not the men are actually progressing as they run forward. So it's an interesting, because the work is a formal study of values at the same time that it's addressing issues of race in modern society. Now, even though the issue of color has come up a few times in this chapter. Now we really can consider color, because color, as I said, is very much a function of light. There was Sir Isaac Newton discovers in the 1660s that color and light are related, that you can use a prism to break up sunlight and you get, the color spectrum presented to you. And Newton was the first to arrange colors into a circle, into what we call the conventional color wheel, which is what I'm showing you here. So this is the simplest color wheel. There's different color wheels that are in use. I'm using this one because it's the one we're kind of raised on. I think it's the one most related to how painters function. So when we look at the color wheel, there's three categories of colors that are usually depicted. Primary colors, secondary colors, and intermediate or tertiary colors. And your primary colors are the colors you know. They're the colors that can't be created by other colors, which are yellow, red, and blue, and they're all indicated by ones on the color wheel. If you mix any two primary colors together, you get the secondary colors. So yellow and blue make green, and red and yellow make orange, and red and blue make violet, and those are indicated by twos on the color wheel. And then if you mix any of these secondary colors with their adjacent primary colors, you create the intermediate or tertiary colors, which are indicated by three. So that's yellow-green, yellow-orange, red-violet, blue-violet, and blue-green. When we talk about color, we consider a variety of things. What you're seeing here is simply hue, which is the identity of the color. Value, as we've already discussed in relationship to light, describes the lightness or darkness of the color. And then saturation or intensity describes whether or not the color is bright or dull. Okay, so there's several different characteristics that make up color, and these are all things that the artists consider when they're making their choices. Now, let's talk about some of the choices that artists make. When we talk about the artist's choice of color, we're talking about the artist's palette. And the artist can have either a very wide palette, which we call an open palette, meaning the artist is choosing colors from all throughout the color wheel, or an artist might choose to have a closed or restricted palette, where an artist will choose a very narrow range of colors for their work. When an artist chooses a restricted palette, they may choose a temperature to pursue, which we consider warm or cool colors. So, for example, if an artist chooses colors from one side of the color wheel, ranging from the greenish yellow through red, you would have a warm palette predominantly. If the artist chooses from the opposite side, which ranges from the violets to the darker green, you would call that a cool color palette. And whenever an artist chooses colors all from one section of the color wheel, or colors that are all adjacent to each other on the color wheel, we call it an analogous color scheme. So here's examples of two different objects, one painting, one installation, where the artists are selecting their palette in a restricted way. The picture by Pablo Picasso on the left, the self-portrait with a cloak from 1901, is an example of a restricted palette in a cool color scheme. Okay, and again, it's an analogous color scheme because all of the colors, for the most part, the palette is chosen in the blue and green range. Right, there's the hint of the peach that's used for the skin tone, but it's predominantly this blue and green range, and we call this Picasso's blue period. Right, which he begins, blue period is really from around 1901 to 1904. It's a small number of years that Picasso is painting in Paris after leaving Barcelona, and it's following the suicide of his friend, a man named Casagemas, where he said that after he learned of Casagemas' death, that it compelled him to paint in blues, and so he called it his blue period. You could see the effect of the blue period. Here again we have this idea, and we'll talk about it, that colors have certain impacts on us or meaning, but the works are very somber from this period and restrained, and the palette has a lot to do with that choice. Alternatively, I can put this work next to what has basically a warm color palette, which is Jane Hammond's Fallen, which is an installation. what this is, Jane Hammond's Fallen, is a very interesting work of art. It's a work of art that she began in 2004 to commemorate soldiers who died in the war, right? So it's meant to be a war memorial, really in the way in Iraq. And it's meant to be, I don't know if she says Iraq and Afghanistan or just Iraq. And that's actually an interesting question I need to think about for a second. I think it's Iraq. It is Iraq, because after Obama declared the end to combat in Iraq, she finished the work. But in any case, what she was doing is she was making a work that was meant to memorialize each soldier who had died. So it's actually quite related to the idea of Maya Lin and her war memorial, because this image is inscribed with names. But what's interesting is it's not retrospective. It's something that was actually ongoing. So when she began the work in 2004, she began with 1,511 leaves, each inscribed with the name of a soldier who died in Iraq up to that point. And she keeps adding new leaves as more soldiers die. So the Whitney got the work in 2006. By 2007, it had 3,786 leaves. And in September 2011, it had 4,455 leaves. The last leaf was added, I think, on December 31st, 2011. Only about 1 in 6 names are actually visible, because it's actually a pile of leaves, and her technique is quite interesting. Here you can see it up close. What she does is she travels across the country. She wants to plan the idea of a fallen leaf as the metaphor for a lost life, which is not a new metaphor. That's something that was used as a metaphor for fallen soldiers in World War II. But here what she would do is she would travel across the country to represent the wide, origins of all the soldiers who had died during the war. And she would collect leaves, and then she would scan the leaves, right, so into a computer, and then actually print them out on archival paper, make them into digital prints, and then she would manipulate them to make them look more real and like actual leaves. So she would thicken the stem, she would mold the leaves to make them look more authentic, she would include blemishes and veins on the leaves, and then she would dip them in a medium to give them the texture of something that was real. So it's actually quite an interesting technique, because on the one hand, her original concept of the falling leaf is very unlike a traditional war memorial, because war memorials, we generally think of things as permanent. They're done out of granite and they're done out of metal. And here she was doing it out of leaves, something so ephemeral and temporary. But here, by turning it into archival photo paper, she's actually trying to make something ephemeral and temporary more permanent. So it's an interesting technique that she's using. And then she would hand inscribe the names on them. And so, as an effect, it's kind of like walking around a Pollock painting spread out on the floor in front of you. But the work itself, it's kind of simple, because to see a pile of fallen leaves is not something unusual. It's only within the context that it takes on this kind of meaning. And even her technique, which requires so much labor on her part, is sort of this metaphor for the idea of remembrance and the process of remembrance. But again, as a color scheme, she chooses a very specific color scheme. But of course, her color scheme in some respects is chosen by nature. What we're going to see is that artists choose their color schemes for the greatest possible effect that they can get. Now, artists use colors in all different ways. Some of them are going to use color for emotional impact. An artist like Cezanne is using color in almost a scientific way. This is an image, Basket of Apples, by Paul Cezanne, a post-impressionist artist from the end of the 19th century. Your book brought up this work when it wanted to discuss line, to talk about Cezanne's unusual use of line, where the lines in the picture don't add up, don't correspond to each other, for example, one edge of the table to the other. But where Cezanne is really most interesting is in his use of color. What ends up happening in the 19th century, there is in the scientific community a real discussion of color and how our eyes perceive color. So scientists were investigating color. man named Chevreul or Ogden Rood. These were guys writing in the first half of the 19th century who were talking about physiologically the way we perceive color. And so Cézanne is interested in this notion. And so he begins to explore the way that warm and cool colors act differently. Cool colors tend to recede from the eye, while warm colors tend to advance. So Cézanne's experiment here in painting the basket of apples, and a lot of these still lifes he painted, was to try to use color to construct three-dimensional form rather than light and shade. Okay, so traditionally, if you wanted to create a still life with apples, you would use chiaroscuro. You would model from light to shade, from one side of the fruit to the other, to create volume and to create a convincing illusion that that object exists in a real three-dimensional space with a light source. Cézanne is trying to use color to do the same thing. And by the way, he painted so slow. The story with Cézanne was that he had to use plastic fruit because everything rotted. But still lifes were perfect for him because they didn't complain. So what Cézanne is doing is, if you look at the background, the cool palette he chooses for the back of the wall, and then the warm orangey brown of the table which advances towards you. So already he's trying to create spatial illusions not by the way the lines of the table are foreshortened, but by the relationship of warm and cool. Even on individual pieces of fruit. If you look right near the bottle, for example, you'll see some fruit, some apples that lie right in front of the bottle on the table. And you'll notice fruit where one side of the fruit is painted greenish and one side is painted peach. And so the artist is trying to use this color relationship of cool and warm colors to actually take the place of light and shadow. Okay, so artists like this begin to experiment with color and how they actually work to create structure. Now, other color choices are not from just cool and warm sides of the palette or sides of the color wheel. But artists use a larger combination of colors to achieve effects. Now, Romare Bearden is an artist here who's using what we would call an open palette. So rather than the restricted palette we saw in Hammond or Picasso, Bearden is choosing an open palette because it chooses colors from throughout the color wheel. He's using warm and cool colors together. And in effect, what he's doing here is he's using complementary colors. Okay, so when you use a complementary color, you're using colors that are opposite each other on the color wheel. So you're juxtaposing red and green, you're juxtaposing yellow and violet, and you're juxtaposing blue and orange. We don't have a lot of violet in this work, but we do see particularly the use of blue and orange, and we also very much see the use of red and green. And the idea is that you could use complementary colors together to create a greater intensity. That when you use colors on the opposite side of the color wheel together, the impact is greater, the emotional impact, because it makes each of the colors appear brighter. Right? And Bearden talked about this as a specific strategy. He said, sometimes in order to heighten the character of a painting, I introduce what appears to be a dissonant color, where the reds, browns, and yellows disrupt the placidity of the blues and the greens. Now, this particular work, it's called Sheba, and it's meant to be the Arab queen Sheba, right? She brought the Muslim religion to Ethiopia. And it's meant to show her as this sort of majestic image of recognizable black figures, which at the time that Bearden was doing this in the 1970s, he was both breaking conventions in being a successful African-American artist, but also being an artist that was painting so-called black subject matter. So he really was a groundbreaker, and he, in more ways than one. Right, you could see that here he creates a picture. It's very much in terms of line. It's a picture very much created on a grid. It's a very geometric work. But what he was trying to do was to call attention that even though he was painting an African subject, he was using a very traditional sort of African-American form because the work is meant to recall a patchwork quilt. And in fact, your book calls this an oil on canvas, but he's actually also using paper and cloth by means of collage in the work. In other words, gluing paper and cloth to the surface. So he's using real pieces of fabric, which allude to the idea of weaving and quilt making, which is something that he relates to his own heritage. So on the one hand, it's meant to show sort of aristocratic, right, queenly figure. And on the other hand, it relates very much to his own personal tradition and what was usually considered a low-level art or a craft. But again, for him, it's about creating these dramatic relationships by using the colors that are opposite each other on the color wheel. And a lot of this is based on the notion of what we call simultaneous contrast, which is the idea that complementary colors, first of all, when they appear together, they make each other appear more intense. So you can see that if you look in the lower left-hand corner of this example. If you put a green square in the middle of red and a red square in the middle of green, they appear brighter than those colors would appear on their own, right? Which is this impact of simultaneous contrast. It also has to do with the fact, and this was discovered in the 19th century, right around 1820, there is this law that was formulated by a man named Michel Eugene Chevreul, who was a scientist who was studying optics and color theory. And he said that the way that complementary colors relate to each other is that a complementary color will throw its complement onto forms next to it. Now, it's hard to understand, so let me explain it. I've got two examples here, the one in the top left corner and the one in the middle on the right, which are these circles that are intersecting two different colored squares. If you look at that top left example, you'll see the yellow square and the white square, and then this gray circle that runs through it. If you look at the gray circle against the white square, and block it with your hand if you have to, you'll notice that that circle looks truly gray. If you now look at the gray circle where it crosses the yellow square, you'll notice that the gray actually appears to be purple, like a lavender color. And it's not. It's the same color. The reason it appears purple to us is because, according to Chevreul's law of simultaneous contrast, that yellow square is throwing its complement, this happens in your eye, onto the form next to it. So the yellow square, the opposite of yellow on the color wheel is violet, is throwing violet onto that gray form and making us read it as lavender or as violet, as opposed to reading it as truly gray. So it's the idea that colors affect what's actually next to it. And you can see the same thing if you look at the set of squares, the green and white squares, with the blue circle crossing it. If you look at the blue circle over the white square, it looks truly blue. Right? If you look at now the blue circle over the green, it appears again to be violet. And the reason that it does is because the green square is throwing its complement, which is red, onto the blue, and then the red and blue combine in your eye and create this violet color. So colors actually do physiologically impact how we read each other, and so the choices that the artists make are really kind of important. I mean, the other great experiment of simultaneous contrast is this, which is the idea that according to the way your eye works, the cells in your eye can only respond to one complementary color at a time. So when it responds to one and then it responds to the other, the colors appear, again, as I say, more intense. You can see again that this is physiological by staring at the red dot. Okay, so we stare at the red dot, stare for a minute. Okay, now keep staring at the screen, and when I make the red dot disappear, you'll see a green, or sometimes a bluish green circle that exists where the red field was, right, which is called an after image. So again, it's this understanding that we actually do on our eye see complementary colors, and they impact the way that they would also be viewed in a work like a painting. So, in representational art, your book lists 4 different ways that an artist might use color, 4 different kinds of color that might be used. Local color, perceptual color, optical mix, and arbitrary color. The first 2 are actually pretty easy. Local color is the color things are. This banana is yellow, this apple is red, the car is blue. It's its actual hue. So if I show you the local color of this stack of hay, you could see this sort of yellowish brownish color. That is its local color. An artist, though, might not just paint local color. He might paint perceptual color. And what perceptual color is not the actual color something is, but the color that we perceive having to do with conditions of light and atmospheric circumstances. So atmospheric perspective is an example of perceptual color. The actual local color of a tree-covered mountain is going to be brown and green, but if you look at its perceptual color in the background of the Virgin of the Rocks, for example, you might get blue-gray. Right? Because of the atmospheric conditions, that's how we read the color, and it's not its real local color. So as an example, Claude Monet's haystacks, or now they're more commonly called his grain sacks. Claude Monet did a very interesting thing. We talked about Monet already, the idea that he was interested very much in perceptual color, paint exactly what you see. But in the 1890s, you know, Monet had a very unsuccessful career early on when he was doing works like Impression Sunrise. But towards the end of his career, he breaks through when he starts doing his series pictures. And he does a series of Rouen Cathedral, and he does another series of grain stacks. They were things that were commonly visible in the French countryside. But the idea was that instead of painting it according to its local color, he painted it according to how he saw it. So he did a series. He would paint sometimes between 25 and 40 images of the same object, but he would paint them at different times of day and in different weather and lighting conditions. So he would pick a different canvas to work on, depending on whether it was overcast, or sunny, or sunset, or noon, or sunrise, and then, or different seasons, and then would focus on the idea of perceptual color rather than on actually painting what the subject was. He cared not at all that it was a grain stack. It was about painting the time of day. It's a really radical thing that Monet did. But in any case, that's an example of perceptual color. Now, optical mix is a little bit more specific, because not that many artists truly pursue the idea of optical mix. But the idea of optical mix is that an artist is trying to paint images or paint colors so that they actually mix on the eye rather than on the surface of the work, on the canvas itself. So it truly is that, right? Is the eye mixing the colors, right? So Seurat would put points, right, of color next to each other. His technique we call, therefore, pointillism. Seurat, by the way, is another post-impressionist artist like Cézanne, who begins to pay attention to color theory that emerged in the first half of the 19th century and try to apply it to his work, which is how he gets the notion for optical mix. In this particular work, it's called the Can-Can, he paints a scene of nighttime dancers. It's a nocturnal scene. You see musicians in the foreground as well as spectators, a line of dancers. You could see the lights up above. And what Seurat is doing is he's not trying to create tension by using complementary colors, but he's juxtaposing colors because his belief was that colors that mix in the retina would be more pure and brighter and more vibrant than any colors he could mix on his palette. Again, because the idea is simultaneous contrast. So if you look at this work, for example, look toward the top of the picture and you'll see where there are lights suspended from the top. And you could see where the artist creates these halos of blue and then orange around the lights. Well, blue and orange are complementary colors. So the idea is that if you believe in this notion of simultaneous contrast, the blue would make the blue brighter and the orange would make the orange brighter, and you would get this much more vibrant effect. When you get up close to Seurat, you see that not just the colors are placed next to each other to create this effect, but actually within each individual color there's a series of dots. Again, there's no line in Seurat, it's all just composed of dots, and there's no modeling. That these dots actually play off of each other on the eye. Right, and here you could see Seurat's surface of the Can-Can up close. Again, where he's juxtaposing oranges and blues with the idea that they're going to make the colors seem more vivid and more intense because they're going to have this effect of simultaneous contrast. It doesn't entirely work, and people notice that, I think, pretty quick with Seurat, that if you stand at exactly the right distance, perhaps it works, but if you get too close to the work, sometimes the dots have the effect of canceling each other out, creating a very muddy surface. And the optical mix never is entirely complete. You always had this somewhat grainy appearance to it. So it doesn't necessarily have the effect that he wanted, but you could see what the scientific pursuit for Seurat was. A more modern artist who's picked up on this notion of simultaneous contrast and optical mix is Chuck Close. We've met Chuck Close already once before. We were looking at hyper-realistic art when we looked at his big self-portrait. This is a later portrait that Close does, when Close begins experimenting also with the idea of optical mix. In these later works, instead of just realistically airbrushing or section by section of the grid, transferring photograph into canvas, here he actually almost works as if he's in pixels. He divides the grid into a series of very, very, very small squares, and in each square, through this process of layering colors, he tries to create the perfect optical mix. Right? He calls his work layered pointillism. In any case, like the other works, they're based on photographs. There's no real commentary. It's that mugshot motif. They're the same large-scale works. And like Seurat's picture, it's a very different picture whether or not you view it from far away or up close. From far away, all of the colors do blend on your eye, and you have this photorealistic image. But up close, the effect is of a series of abstract dots and colors. And Chuck Close, by the way, you can go on YouTube. You can see wonderful videos of Chuck Close actually painting. But he describes his method, and he describes it in comparison to a game of golf, which is sort of a fascinating analogy. And here's what he says. Golf is the only sport in which you move from the general to the specific. In the beginning, when you take your first shot, you can't even see the pin. And in a matter of 3 or 4 strokes, you're supposed to be in the cup, a very small, specific place, a very long ways away. I thought of the gridded canvas as a golf course, and each square of the grid is a par 4 hole. Then, just to complicate things and make the game more interesting, I teed off in the opposite direction of the pin. For example, I knew that the color of the skin was going to be in the orange family, so I started out by putting down a thin wash of blue, green, or purple, something very different from what the final color would be. The second color then had to go miles to alter the first one. So for this big correcting stroke, I chose a hue that moved me in the generic color family I should have been aiming for. Now I had moved into orange, but it was too yellow. So in the middle of that stroke, I put down a gob of red to move it into a reddish orange. Then I was at the equivalent of being on the green, and hopefully quite close to the cup. But the color was still much too bright. So the final stroke was a little dot of blue, the complementary color, which optically mixed with the orange and lowered its intensity, dropping it down to an orangish brown. I was in the cup. It was possible to have a birdie, to come in a stroke early. It was even possible to have an eagle, to come in 2 strokes under par. Of course, it was also equally possible to have a bogey or a double bogey, and even get mired in some aesthetic sand trap, just making strokes and getting nowhere at all. So he shows you the sort of synthesis. I mean, maybe Seurat's technique isn't perfect. Here he's showing you that on the sort of microscopic level, he's doing the same thing Seurat's doing, using the relationship of colors to feed off of each other and to ultimately create the exact effect of the hue he's looking for. The last way that your book sets out as a way you could use color is arbitrary color. And a great example of this is Henri Matisse's The Woman in the Red Hat. Arbitrary color is when the color has no relationship to the optical or local colors. I mean, the artist paints things in colors he chooses for entirely different reasons. And this is a perfect example. This particular work, it's a work from 1905, and it's a kind of picture, the name of the style we call fauvism. And that's because when these works, this was one of a series of works that was exhibited in 1905 at the Autumn Salon. When the work was seen by critics, it was actually in a room with a Donatello-like sculpture. So a Renaissance-like sculpture in the middle of the room, and one critic called the paintings Donatello among the wild beasts. And so this fauvism comes from the term of the wild beast. And so here you see Matisse using color in this arbitrary way. The picture got really quite a stir. He says, by the way, I mean, he says he's using color in order to get a reaction. What Matisse says is this. He says, what characterized Fauvism was that we rejected imitative colors, and that with pure colors we obtained stronger reactions, more striking simultaneous reactions, and there was also the luminosity of our colors. So what he says he's about is expressing. So he chooses color for expressive purposes as opposed to choosing color to represent what's actually there. And this was a portrait of his wife, painted in a very sort of conventional portrait style pose at the time. You could see her leaning perhaps on an armchair. It's actually hard to quite make it out what we see, and holding a fan in front of her. But what the critics reacted to was not only the color, but then also his very sort of aggressive, sometimes considered unpleasant manage of painting. It's a very raw technique. There's places where the painting is very dry, and where it's like you could see pencil coming through, and where the paint is scratched through on the surface. I could show you an up-close detail. And it was actually, the story was quite funny because it was purchased by an American collector. There were two collectors, Leo and Gertrude Stein, who were great American patrons. They were collecting works in Paris to hang in their Paris apartment. They were some of the earliest first collectors of Picasso, for example. And Leo Stein ended up buying the picture. Not at first, because at first he referred to the picture as the nastiest smear I had ever seen. And he said he had to actually sort of come to grips with it. And he said it took him a few days to get over the unpleasantness of the putting on of the paint. But ultimately he buys the work. So again, this is the example of arbitrary color, because the colors we see have no real impact or relationship to what the local colors are. They're meant to express the personal feelings of the artist. Now, while we think about expression, a lot of artists pursue really none of these. They pursue instead symbolic color, which we talked about the symbolism of light, or how artists like Thomas Cole have used the symbolism of light and dark to suggest meaning. Colors can also work the same way, where an artist might choose a color not just for simultaneous contrast or its visual impact, or not simply arbitrarily, but to choose colors because those colors to them have specific meanings. An example of an artist pursuing this idea is someone like Vincent van Gogh. And we've met Van Gogh before, and Van Gogh, by the way, is an artist who's incredibly interested in using complementary colors to create. The complementary colors intensify each other, and so but they're dissonant colors. They don't work together. They're at odds with each other, and so Van Gogh often uses those kind of colors to create dissonance in the work, to create a physical reaction to it. Go back and look at Starry Night, and you'll see that the green cypress trees are filled with red, and that the sky is both purple and blue, and it's covered with these orange and yellow stars. I mean, he's playing with this idea of simultaneous contrast to evoke an emotional, heightened response in you. And you see the same thing in this work, which is the Night Cafe. He wrote a lot. Remember we talked about Van Gogh, that he talked about his pictures, and he wrote quite a bit about them in his correspondence to his brother. And he wrote a letter about this work, and he said, "In my picture, The Night Cafe, I've tried to express the idea that the cafe is a place one can ruin oneself, run mad, or commit a crime. I've tried to express the terrible passions of humanity by means of red and green. Everywhere there's a clash and contrast of the most alien reds and greens. So I've tried to express, as it were, the powers of darkness in a low wine shop, and all this in an atmosphere like a devil's furnace of pale sulfur. It is a color not locally true from the point of view of the stereoscopic realist, but color to suggest the emotion of an ardent temperament." The story of this, he had planned on if I'm not mistaken, he had planned on painting a brothel scene, but he didn't have any money to pay a model. So he decided to paint this night cafe. And it's one of these kind of places where people would hang out in the middle of the night if they had no money to pay for a place to stay, or if they were too drunk. presumably get prostitutes. So it was meant to be an uncomfortable place, and Picasso experiments this by using color relationships, which he writes quite a bit about. Right? And here he says, I have tried to express the terrible passions of humanity by means of red and green, again, complementary colors. The room is blood red and dark yellow, with the green billiard table in the middle. There are 4 citron yellow lamps, with a glow of orange and green. Everywhere there's a clash and contrast of the most disparate reds and greens, in the figures of little sleeping hooligans, in the empty, dreary room, in violet and blue. And you'll see the blue of the people sleeping on the tables next to the orange of the walls, and then the clash of the red and green between the walls and the ceiling, and then the specter-like proprietor in the white coat who seems to hover behind the billiard table. By the way, Van Gogh's sense of uneasiness and discomfort that he's trying to create through his use of color, he also does through perspective. So again, an artist uses more than one tool. So you could see the very sort of like jarring perspective with a vanishing point somewhere that's not consistent. In the upper left-hand corner of the scene creates this sense that the furniture, like the billiard table in the middle of the room, is about to fall off the floor. So he's actually playing with more than one device, but again, trying to create this sense of discomfort in us when we look at the work. Kandinsky is another artist, and the last one that we'll look at, who likes to use color and opposing color for symbolic reason, but not for the dissonance that someone like Van Gogh was trying to express, this sort of seedy underworld, but for instead this sort of spiritual meaning. Kandinsky's a fascinating artist. He's one of the first, if not the first, painter to truly explore non-objective painting, painting with no subject. And in fact, the title here is just called Black Lines, right? Schwarze Linien. But you can still see some reference to landscape, some leftover remnant that is where his first non-objective paintings seem to emerge from. But for him, this work was really about expressing his spirit, his feelings, by orchestrating how he was putting together and assembling color, space, line, form, like how he juxtaposed these things together to express himself. I mean, Kandinsky is an artist. He actually writes several treatises on art. There's one published in 1912 called Concerning the Spiritual in Art, which he expresses these ideas. And in his works, he actually explains his use of color really specifically. He actually related color to a keyboard, to sound. The idea that the artist pulls together color like one pulls together a musical composition. He is not like Seurat or like Chuck Close in that they have this almost scientific pursuit of color. Of his own works, Kandinsky said, nothing of calculation appears, only feeling. And he has a very symbolic understanding of his use of color. Right, and here you could see him describing the color. Blue is the heavenly color. It retreats from the spectator, so he does understand that. Moving towards its own center, it beckons to the infinite, arousing a longing for purity and the supersensuous. Light blue is like the color of is like the sound of the flute. Dark blue has the sound of the cello. So you can actually hear him relating each of the colors to sound. But you can look here. I'll let you look yourself, is different characterizations of the color. So for him, it's all about symbolic relationships and then trying to express his own spiritual state when he paints. In any case, this covers, I guess, some of our basic principles of color and light, but these are all ideas that are going to come back to us in later chapters. But as we go forward, we're going to move away from our primary discussions of things like line and space and color and light and start talking about other choices that artists make in terms of the formal elements.